The Barricaded Heart, Dostoevsky's Pawnbroker, Psychological Patriarchy, and the Ascetical Imperative of Kenosis. Within the suffering, stagnant confines of a 19th century Russian apartment, a bewildered man paces frantically beside the lifeless form of his young wife, bled out internally, who remains clutching a Madonna icon, a final, desperate act of agency that reclaims her heart from her dominator. This protagonist, her beleaguered husband, is confronted with the terminal velocity of a calcified heart that has severed his soul from God, and therefore everyone he encounters, leaving him isolated within a relentless torrent of confused thought. He paces, talking to himself in a frantic effort to justify a system of moral subjugation, desperately seeking to comprehend an existential horror that his rigid worldview can never truly grasp. Fyodor Dostoevsky's 1876, The Meek One, opens with this image of profound spiritual enclosure, a man who has finally achieved the absolute control he craved, only to find himself interned in an empty room with the unfeeling pendulum of being 5 minutes too late. The reader is compelled to endure the internal cacophony of a man who serves as a mere archetype of the Antichrist, bearing witness to the catastrophic fragmentation of a soul imprisoned within its own dream of pride. This supposed dream, in reality, is a nightmare born of the ego, a force that shackles us in a constant state of unconsciousness. Such a state serves as a shallow imitation for the very structures that entrap individuals, creating a destructive cycle of control, seclusion, and suffering for everyone caught within it. Dostoevsky presents the mindset of the dominator as a model of systems we're all too familiar with: patriarchy, misogyny, capitalism, imperialism, etc., all predicated on exploited wealth accumulation and a will to do violence that leads naturally to a delusional sense of superiority. Through this devastating cautionary tale of a broken man, Dostoevsky offers a profoundly subversive medicine to perhaps wake up the reader, eschewing didactic moralizing to issue a haunting summons to confront the radical requirements of the love Christ commanded in John 13:34 to, quote, love one another as I have loved you, unquote. A divine imperative whose source the pawnbroker has tragically forgotten, and whose very source is obscured by pride and shame that confined him. Through this lens, we see example of one who seeks self-aggrandizement over the divine, a figure who, quote, exalts himself over everything that is called God or is worship, so that he sits in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God, unquote. Ultimately succumbing to the spiritual enclosure of his own closed heart. The pawnbroker is a mere symbol of a spiritual condition that plagues many modern men who ultimately buckle under the weight of psychological patriarchy. Today, we witness the male loneliness epidemic, where 15% of men report having no friends, and 6 in 10 men under 30 remain single. And suicide continues to claim too many men, where nihilism remains a rational conclusion for those who remain asleep. This phenomenon represents far more than a mere statistical shift. It is a profound crisis of the soul, a descent into a spiritual enclosure that defies simple quantification. To illuminate Dostoevsky's devastating prognosis of the hardened male heart, the critique of radical feminist bell hooks regarding psychological patriarchy offers a vital through line connecting the suffocating apartment of the 19th century Russia to our endearing postmodern age, where men remain desperately in need of a remedy for the, quote, life-threatening social disease, unquote, that ails us all. A potent source of spiritual medicine to offer an awakened heart is shared by Saint Elder Aimilianos, as a direct countermeasure to the modern despair that continues to abscond love behind the rigid, airless walls of traditional masculinity. Although secular critiques of political economic structures provide necessary points of reference, it is increasingly clear that simply pointing to these structures remains a hollow exercise, failing to salvage humanity from the long, weary arc of a world constructed by and for the ego. Instead, the Church Fathers offer a path of true convalescence, leading toward the radical vulnerability of ascetical self-emptying through the living presence of Christ. Within the relentless nightmare that maintains lost egos, leveraging structural patterns of what ails the pawnbroker, Bell Hooks, in her essay, Understanding Patriarchy, identifies a life-threatening social disease that she terms psychological patriarchy. It is a system that demands men become emotional cripples, repressing every nuance of feeling except for fear, rage, and confusion. This indoctrination begins in childhood, where boys are taught that to be human is to be feminine, and to be feminine is to be weak. To survive, the man constructs a stern and silent persona, trading his capacity for intimacy for a vapid sense of control. This is the tragedy of modern men who agree with the pawnbroker's statement, "No one really knows me well." He has been taught that his value is defined by his will to do violence, if not physical, then psychological violence of emotional distance and moral subjugation. The pawnbroker is the ultimate victim and oppressor within this framework. The very foundation of his marriage, a 41-year-old man acquiring a 16-year-old desperate, impoverished girl, is Dostoevsky's devastating critique of the patriarchal trap, a relationship inherently flawed and depraved from its premise. This predatory dynamic is mirrored in his chosen profession, pawnbroking, a parasitic enterprise where he extracts both material profit and an empty sense of superiority from the desperation of the poor. Indeed, he approaches the sacred union of marriage through the same lens of exploitation, viewing his wife's poverty and youth as the very asset that will secure his moral subjugation of her. The broken man, whose will was shattered by his earlier humiliations, most notably being ousted from his military commission, he seeks the self through the vile business of pawnbroking to exact his vengeance on society. The pawnbroker perceives his 16-year-old child bride as a being that simply must submit, and he intentionally dampens her youthful enthusiasm to preserve her persona as an enigma, only manifested through his stern silence. Throughout the narrative, the protagonist maintains the arrogant claim that he can understand everything, yet his conviction in a superiority is rooted in an age disparity, causes him to perilously overlook his wife's personal agency. This toxic relationship reaches its zenith when his 16-year-old wife aims his own revolver, a tool intended to enforce her compliance, directly at his temple. In a surreal manifestation of patriarchal fantasy, he shuts his eyes and feigns sleep while the gun is pointed at him, convinced that by ignoring the threat, he has maintained total control. In truth, the true power rests entirely with her and the weapon. This is the dominator model Hooks warns against, where love is mistaken for a struggle for power. The result is the male loneliness epidemic personified, a man who has conquered his world only to find he has no one to speak to. The spiritual antithesis to the patriarchal delusion is the radical path laid out by Elder Aimilianos, who cautions that superiority is an impediment to growth, emphasizing that a soul is only rich or great insofar as it is humble and small. This magnitude is unlocked through the profound awareness of one's own nothingness, a self-recognition necessary for salvation. This encounter compels the necessary ascetical self-emptying, kenosis, where one is only filled by God to the degree that voluntary renounces their own substance and being. The true locus of human dignity is not in mastery over other men, but in the body of Christ found within neighbor, transforming the struggle for power into a quest for shared peace. When his wife chooses death over this moral subjugation, she shatters his system of control, leaving him in a state of isolation that mirrors the 44% of men today who have recently experienced the same isolated darkness. In a frantic attempt to navigate this modern despair, numerous men gravitate toward the pawnbroker's stern silence, unwittingly perpetuating a hollow enigma that secures only a state of perpetual isolation. Dostoevsky illustrates a biting irony in the pawnbroker's devotion to silence. His internal, relentless cacophony of his mind only serves as a prelude to a horrific, inexplicable death. This rigid, analytical system compels many to seek guidance from those similarly trapped behind the prison bars of a fractured male psychology. To address modern despair, many men retreat to the stern silence of the pawnbroker, unknowingly adopting a hollow enigma that ensures eternal solitude. Dostoevsky highlights the irony in this devotion to silence as the relentless eternal noise of the protagonist's mind merely precedes a horrific and inexplicable end. This rigid system leads many to seek counsel from figures trapped within a similar fractured male psychology. Media personalities like Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes, or even Andrew Tate often advocate for reinforcing traditional male archetypes as defensive measures. These suggestions, ranging from performative roles as providers and protectors designed to subjugate women under the pretense of rescue, to more bizarre ideas like tanning testicles, misleadingly offer a path to reclaim status as dominators rather than accepting the radical vulnerability of becoming a servant of Christ. Yet, as Dostoevsky's narrative devastatingly reveals, these paradigms are often but fresh masks for the same dream of pride. The pawnbroker's calculated frugalness, buttressed by sheer ego, leads to a pursuit of evasive happiness to save 30,000 rubles, a hoard intended to finance a life of absolute entrenched solitude with a child bride he has systematically captured, epitomizes the hollow idolatry of self-sufficiency. The soul's enclosure is fated for all in such a realm. Today, this pursuit of self-mastery contributes to a tragic reality, that 80% of suicides are among men, and heightened risks of premature death and cardiovascular illness are also greatly associated by men through social isolation. This resurgence of the self represents a profound descent into a spiritual enclosure where the heart remains airless, rendering the radical vulnerability of connection and grace intolerable and compelling, a desperate grasp for power predicated on absolute entrenched loneliness. If patriarchy is indeed a life-threatening social disease, what potent remedy or spiritual antidote exists to mend the fractured male soul? Should our response merely be a collective secular effort to dismantle its external structures? While a critique of this ancient exhausted system is undoubtedly a necessary point of reference, we must remain wary of such a Faustian undertaking that risks becoming an ironic exercise that leaves us divided and further confused in thought. After all, external structures are erected upon the foundations of the ego. In our quest for socio-political righteousness, we must consider the latent spiritual harm that might be unleashed by these noble intentions. What happens when poisoned individuals seek liberation using the very weapons of the world that initially isolated us from God? The answers to our modern despair are perhaps more radical, yet simpler than we might suppose. Elder Aimilianos offers a path of true convalescence, a spiritual cure that transcends the political economic realm. He observes that we are only filled by God to the degree that we are empty. If psychological patriarchy leaves men depleted through a perpetual conflict over unseen paradigms and a will to do violence, the elder proposes a divine alternative, an ascetical self-emptying. This practice stands as the direct spiritual countermeasure to the patriarchal obsession with mastership and control. While Dostoevsky's Pawnbroker used his suffering as a shield for his stern silence, Aimilianos calls for voluntary death of the ego to create a dwelling place for the living presence. The pawnbroker's catastrophic misalignment of the nous, the spiritual intellect, and the seat of personhood stem from a calculating system that prioritized human logic and intellectual deliberation over the heart, thereby separating the nous from the soul and precluding union with God. On the surface, this isolation is the emotional crippling of bell Hook's critique. However, liberation from the barricaded heart is achieved only when the intellect becomes subservient to the spirit. To liberate the empty rooms of Dostoevsky's tragedy, a man must move beyond the dream of pride and self-castigation toward a radical entrusting of the self to God, a union with God. Within the suffocating parameters of this depraved union, communion remained an impossibility, necessitating a terminal contemplation of the bride's tragic reclamation of agency. In a final, desperate act of spiritual agency, she undergoes a radical self-burial, plummeting from the stagnant enclosure of the apartment while clutching the icon of the Mother God, a defiant retrieval of her soul from the very structures of a world that would deny her a hallowed rest. This 16-year-old victim existed within the terminal momentum of absolute destitution and the stagnant walls of a domestic nightmare. Prior to the pawnbroker's predatory intervention, her material suffering was total. She was compelled to pawn the last vestiges of her identity, from the ancestral icons to threadbare furs, merely to finance a frantic search for labor. These advertisements, which transitioned from professional pleas to a harrowing willingness to do labor without salary, reveal a life interned with the rigid confines of necessity. The socio-economic violence was further exasperated by the psychological cruelty of two bad aunts, who viewed her as a mere commodity to be sold to a shopkeeper who had already consumed the lives of two previous wives. Her subsequent alliance with the pawnbroker was never a sacrament, but a desperate flight toward a perceived deliverer who quickly manifested as a dominator. Within the spiritual enclosure of his stern silence, her despair birthed a subversive rebellion, manifested through a clandestine act and unauthorized loans, until the moment she leveled his own revolver at his temple. The surreal manifestation of the dominator model reached its zenith when his sudden airless transports of love proved more intolerable than his previous distance. Finding the weight of moral subjugation absolute, she embraced the radical vulnerability of the pavement, seeking the peace that the ego's rigid system could never provide. The ultimate tragedy of her liberation is that she, too, remains ensnared in an ego that seeks control through negation. If only she had been granted the grace of true disillusionment, with the prison bars of the world, perhaps she could have glimpsed the hollow fate of a society that compels a living nightmare over the experience of Christ's love.